Hello, let's talk moths, specifically clothes moths and case bearing clothes moths, because they're the ones that will very happily hide in the little dark corners of your home and your stash and eat away through your woollens, your lovely handmade items, and your beautifully curated stash and your lovely handmade blankets, quietly hiding, doing all their damage and not letting you know that they're there. So, let me show you what I do to prevent moths in my household and in my stash in particular. And the reason I'm recording this now is because it is beginning of August here, where I am in the UK, and it means that the nights are starting to get a little bit darker, but it's still warm weather, so we're more likely to have the curtains open and the window open, and for it to be darker outside but lights on in the house, attracting moths into our house. So this is a really good time to be vigilant for allowing beasties to come into your house. First up, what are you looking for? So there are a few phases within the life cycle of a moth that you will see. The most likely one that you're going to be able to see within your household is an actual moth itself, flying about maybe at dusk or when it gets to darker times. But again, they're going to be coming from quiet crevices in your house, so you might not actually see them. But if you see a moth, you need to be able to identify whether it's one of those two clothes moths or not. So the standard clothes moth is a kind of silky, furry looking, it's about 8mm long, and it's a creamy colour, almost like a pearlescent colour. And then the case bearing clothes moth is slightly more beige, and it's got 3 little dots. They both have cocoons, which are about 1 centimetre long and look like a slightly furry grain of rice, and they can either be creamy coloured or, depending on the moth, it will reflect whatever colour of the fibre that they've been chomping through. So my lived experience of having moths decimate our 100% teal cream carpet was that I found them because I saw some moths, and then I found all of the teal coloured cocoons, so I was able to really hone in on where they were really nesting out and chomping through the carpet. So that's another thing to look for. I think the most difficult element that you're looking for are the eggs, which are extremely small, oval, and kind of milky, creamy white colour. But they're the hardest thing, I think, to find beyond the moths and the cocoons that you're looking for. I'll put pictures up so you know what it is that they both look like, but the places that you need to look for them, like I say, are the deep recesses in the corners, behind furniture, in the seams of your woollens, right inside cones of yarn or skeins of yarn, in the corners of your stashes and your boxes, buried deeply into the bottom of your project bags. Moths don't like to be disturbed, so they will bury themselves down into where it's lovely and quiet and they can do all of their damage, hopefully being unseen. So you need to take them seriously, and let me show you how I do that as somebody who has a lot of handmade items and a highly curated yarn stash that is worth money that I want to protect. This is how I protect it. First things first, let's talk about what happens when I have new yarn coming into our house. Doesn't matter where I've bought it from, whether it's from a yarn shop, at a yarn show, in a charity shop, from Vinted. I buy yarn from all over the place, and I buy quite a bit of second-hand pre-owned yarn as well. The reality is it doesn't matter whether that yarn is brand new or something that maybe was manufactured 10, 20, 30 years ago and has been sat in a charity shop. I treat them all in exactly the same way, and that is to quarantine them before they're allowed into my main stash. So when yarn comes into the house, the first thing that I do is put it into an IKEA bag, and I'm really specific about this. I use the IKEA bags for a few reasons. One is that they come in really large sizes. So this is the 6 litre bag. It's got really thick plastic and it has a double seal on them. So like in terms of absolute moth protection, this is going to do it. And when I'm quarantining, what that means is I pop my yarn into one of those bags and I put it into our chest freezer for a week. I take it out for a couple of hours to defrost it, and I put it back in for another week. Now don't worry, that is not going to make your yarn brittle, it's not going to affect it in any way. I've never had any negative impact from putting yarn in a freezer for 2 weeks. What it does though, with that break in the thaw in the middle of the 2-week process, is it means that you are absolutely assured that the moths are dead. Any live moths, any larvae, any eggs, they are all completely eradicated. So it's a really good assurance for making sure that you're not bringing any clothes moths into your home, basically. Once I've done that, I will let it completely thaw out in the bag, and then it gets added into my stash. And like I say, I've never found any negatives to that freezing action. It's never affected the label, it's never affected the yarn. It's not in there for long enough. This isn't going into deep freeze for months at a time, it's just a couple of weeks. So that is how I control absolutely what is coming into my home. The one time that I didn't do that quickly enough was actually quite recently. It was my own fault. I'd bought a skein of yarn from a yarn shop. I left it in the bag for a couple of weeks in our bedroom. Then when I went to it, it had been chomped through in numerous places by moths. So what I found, I didn't find any actual moth itself or any of the cocoons. I just found eggs. So whether that moth is then living at large in my house, I haven't found any other evidence of it. But for sure, it had chomped through this skein of yarn. That went to the freezer after I'd balled it up and tried to rescue all of the yarn. But I now have a ball of yarn with multiple ends. It's going to be an absolute pain in the backside to deal with when I finally use that in a design. I could have prevented that, I think, by having dealt with the skein more quickly in my normal process of getting it into quarantine. So, you know, this is a lived experience that I'm talking about with moths, and why I would encourage you to use this quarantine method for anything that is incoming before you introduce it to your big stash. Had I put that skein of yarn with those eggs into my stash, I potentially could have just introduced clothes moths to hundreds of pounds worth of yarn that would all be ruined, and I would have a real moth problem going throughout my home. I'd have a lot of nice woolen blankets, all of my clothes, you know, they really could have attacked a lot of things. So quarantine is key. If you're doing that, then there are some other preventative measures that you can also take. As I've said, moths really love dark little corners where they can hide away. So every now and then, maybe every 3 months, I'm not saying I practice that completely, but I do clean out my stash. Maybe every 3 months would be ideal. Take all of your stash out, no matter how you're storing it, and ideally you would be storing it in tubs that are lockable or in units that are lockable where moths just can't get to it. Take it all out, check every skein to make sure that you've got no activity, again trying to identify either the larvae or eggs or moths themselves. What I would then do is hoover any dust, any evidence that there might be of moths. When you've done that, I thoroughly recommend that you get rid of the hoover bag that you've used, or if it's a bagless one, you quickly empty out what you've got there. When I was dealing with the moth infestation in our carpet, I genuinely hoovered up a moth and I put the power off the hoover and it flew back out the nozzle. So even if you've hoovered it up, it doesn't mean that you've killed the moth. So quickly get rid of whatever the items were within the hoover out and into the bin. When you have emptied your stash out of whatever your storage container is, what I would then do is spray it with an antibac. I've got a recipe in the blog post that this is all part of, which I'll link in the Dropbox below. But basically, inside of my antibac spray that I make, I add cedarwood essential oil, and I also use lavender oil, both of which are scents that moths don't like. Moths are scent sensitive, so you can use cedarwood and you can use lavender as a deterrent for them. So if you're cleaning out your stash anyway, make sure that you're introducing those scents into your stash. This is why people also use lavender pouches in their stash, and I think that's another great idea, especially if every time you go into your stash you can have a little fumble of the pouches release some more essential oils and keep that scent going for longer. If you're not going to clean out your stash regularly, then that is one thing that you can do very quickly, is keep on adding lavender pouches and get the scent of lavender in and through your stash. So you can do that, clean it all out, and then, as I said, check your yarn before you put it back into that container. If you're not lucky enough to have like a cedar box, which is the ideal, isn't it? Because then you've got the scent and you've got something that is locked down that moths won't get into, then try and get it into some form of storage which can be completely closed down. If that's not an option for you and you have to have open baskets, then again, I would go back to good old trusty IKEA bags and keeping them protected in that, or in zipped project bags as well. It's another good way of dealing with them and keeping moths out of your stash. But basically, keep it clean, keep on disturbing, get right into the crevices. If you're in your woolens, then make sure that you're checking down into the seams, particularly the underarms, because moths are also attracted to body scents, and anything that we've left behind from our underarms in our clothing, that is like a buffet for them. So if you haven't yet done like your spring clean of your woolens, this is a really important place to check in the seams and the underarms. Anywhere where your particularly humany scents are going to have impacted in your woolens, I would be checking them regularly. When I do my wardrobe swap out from like autumn winter, I put my woolens away generally. I check through them, I bag them up into large plastic like dry cleaner bags, and they go into the unit underneath our bed, which is a completely sealed unit. So I really seriously make sure that moths can't get into our woolens and my stash. I think the main point is to act really quickly if you think that you have seen a moth or that you have moth activities. Not all moths are going to eat your clothes. In particular, it's the clothes moth and the case-bean enclosed moth. So make sure that you know what you're trying to identify, rather than just eradicating a moth that isn't trying to do any damage to you. I had one in the house last night. It was not a clothes moth of any description. It can hang around for a little while until it makes its way back outside. So I'm not here to like kill things that don't need to be killed, and I can do that by knowing what it is that I'm looking for. I think the most important thing is the quarantining of new stuff that is coming into your household and doing those regular checks so that you know that you haven't introduced a problem into your stash and that it's quietly eating through all of your lovely yarn. So this is part of a much bigger blog post that I've pulled together with a load more detail, and if you need that and the spray recipe that I use for my little moth deterrent, then like I say, that's in the blog post that I've linked in the drop down box below. Thank you.